Hello and welcome to another Game Analyzer, where we take apart your favorite games limb for limb until we're all drenched in red. Here we go. Now there's a lot of trivia out there about the game Mortal Kombat, so much that the games themselves include the trivia. Deadly Alliance, Deception, and Armageddon are examples of this. I'm sure you're tired of hearing about Aeromac, Reptile, and that flaming guy. I'm going to try my best not to reiterate anything that's been said about Mortal Kombat, because you've probably heard them enough. Even with this said, there's still a whole lot to cover about Mortal Kombat. Now keep in mind, I'm only talking about the trilogy, Mortal Kombat 1 through 3, the glory days of Mortal Kombat. Rather than opening up the game and talking about the symbols in the story, I'm going to explain how Mortal Kombat got so successful. It all began with Nirvana, a rock and roll band in which some people credit the entire movement from 80s to 90s. Hair and good times were a thing of the past. Society was letting us know that it was okay to be angry and depressed. Mortal Kombat could not have come at a better time. I like to refer to this era as the Truth Era. It was a really strange time where people spoke about their hostilities and showed their emotions in many ways. Also, media was starting to become more violent. This is where Mortal Kombat comes in. At this time, media, councils, and other organizations highly underestimated the effects video games had on the public. At the time, most organizations ignored video games, and that's where Mortal Kombat would take advantage. I'm not trying to sound like a smartass, but you had to realize that the video game industry at the time mainly targeted kids. Many games were either cartoony or they demonstrated toy war in some way. There were some violent video games. They either heavily targeted adults like the Chainsaw Massacre for Atari, or they had realistic violence like SNK's Art of Fighting, the kind of violence the kids would watch on a PG-13 movie. No game had violence as a theme, and if Mortal Kombat has any theme at all, it's definitely the violence. Keep in mind, parents were probably already letting kids see some PG-13 movies, and some even rated R movies. I know I saw some rated R movies when I was a kid, and you probably did too. It's just something that happens. The difference between video games and TV is that video games are interactive. So when you do a fatality, you are doing the fatality. I believe this is why everyone freaked out over the violence of Mortal Kombat, even though their kids were probably watching equally violent movies. Interaction makes a huge difference. But let's back up and explain how Mortal Kombat targeted kids. I like to compare this idea to South Park. South Park says it doesn't target kids, but yet it's a cartoon, something kids are familiar with, and of course, the characters themselves are kids. In fact, if you knew nothing about South Park and saw screenshots, or even the original opening, it would be easy to identify it as a kids show. Also, I remember seeing plushies of South Park characters in the kids sections of video stores. But now let's look back at Mortal Kombat. Did it target children? It's a no-brainer, of course it did. But let's look at how the original concept of Mortal Kombat itself targeted kids. Now I'm going to go off by a personal experience, since I was a kid when Mortal Kombat was at its peak. In fact, I was born the year Mortal Kombat came out. When I was a kid, I was drawn to Goro. I fell in love with the character immediately as I saw him. As a result, my parents bought me the Goro toys and all that jazz. Goro has a teddy bear effect. Now don't get me wrong, Goro is one evil SOB, but as a kid you don't assume that when you see him. In fact, I didn't even see him as a bad guy. I saw him as a big cuddly teddy bear. Now keep in mind, I was probably around the age of 2 at the time, and I'm really digging into my memory right now. So let's see how it could attract someone a little bit older. Just as vampires and zombies took everyone by storm, ninjas were the craze of the late 80s and early 90s. Now there is no coincidence that ninjas are in the game. Kids love ninjas, and this was because of Ninja Turtles. Whether the Mortal Kombat team wants to admit this or not, ninjas were purposely put in the game to attract kids. But aside from Scorpion and Sub-Zero, the game still has some defining features that can draw on someone who might be sick of ninjas. The main character, Liu Kang, is Asian. At the time, Jackie Chan was kicking ass and more Asian stars were emerging, and people latched on to the idea. Every kid was into Jackie Chan, and most kids loved that kind of action movie. With all the gimmicks in place, I believe Mortal Kombat would have still had success even without the blood. The game mechanics were playable, and it entered the fighting game craze that Street Fighter had created. But Mortal Kombat wanted to stand out and be called better than Street Fighter. After knowing they drew in 2-year-olds with Goro, 3 to 10-year-olds with ninjas, and teens with Liu Kang, they decided to take the next step and take a gamble with the fatality. To a lot of kids, that kind of violence was not allowed to be seen. The adults controlled that kind of thing on films, but this was a video game, something adults didn't know anything about. It was our world. Parents thought the same way. Video games are for kids, right? I can just buy it for them. And that's why the video game industry got in trouble. Their system was broken. There was an unspoken code, but eventually someone took advantage of it. One has to realize that Mortal Kombat purposely targeted kids, and knowingly they showed the violence to the kid on a gamble. And like all twisted deeds, it paid off. Now Mortal Kombat is a franchise just as big or bigger than Street Fighter. They achieved their goal all thanks to that gamble. Many followed in pursuit and some even surpassed in violence. But just as Street Fighter was the innovator, Mortal Kombat was the innovator of overuse of blood in video games. Now this begs the question, what effect did this have on kids? Well, being a kid at the time Mortal Kombat was on fire, I'll tell you. Playing all three Mortal Kombats growing up didn't really do much damage to me as a whole. It basically had the same effect that an R-rated film would have had. Keep in mind, Mortal Kombat isn't realistic. It's still a fantasy, and in fantasies, anything can happen. I will admit though, Mortal Kombat 2 did give me nightmares. I'll share a story because I remember this pretty vividly. I picked Reptile, who was another favorite character of mine, and tried to beat the arcade mode. I fought Kitana in the acid pit, and before I knew it, she knocked me down in there. The image of the skeleton frightened me, and as a result, I did have nightmares. Other than the skeleton though, I didn't have any nightmares of any character in particular. The main thing that crept me out was Mortal Kombat 2's atmosphere. Also around my house, Mortal Kombat had a bit of a lore going on. My uncle and my older brother would tell me stories of Mortal Kombat and how the characters were real. I dreamt of Baraka tickling me, which is pretty scary if you think about it. So maybe Mortal Kombat 2 did have a negative effect on me, so much that I would actually play the first game more often than I would play the second game. When Mortal Kombat 3 came out, the atmosphere lightened up and it became sillier. This immediately cheered me up and made me a Mortal Kombat fan again. And for this reason, I have to give props to Mortal Kombat 3, which is most people's least favorite of the trilogy. Maybe the Mortal Kombat team realized that the tone of the last game was too serious, and that since kids were their main players, they decided to have a heart and tone it down. After playing Mortal Kombat 3, Mortal Kombat 2 became easier for me to play, because the characters I see in Mortal Kombat 2 were involved in all the silliness in Mortal Kombat 3. Also in Mortal Kombat 3, the fatalities were ridiculous. They weren't as realistic as the second games, and I think this was also another decision made by the fact that kids were playing the game. Now that the fans that grew up with Mortal Kombat are older, they no longer have to make decisions to cater to children. I do notice that younger kids still pick up the new Mortal Kombat games, and now that the new Mortal Kombat is coming out as violent as ever, I have a feeling someone or something might get involved. With the ESRB ratings though, Mortal Kombat can be whatever it wants now, and even though it's getting some younger attention, it isn't purposely targeting kids like it did in the past. The game can get as dark as it wants, and as serious as it wants. The Mortal Kombat games helped create a new era. You can tell other outlets of media capitalized on what Mortal Kombat did, and ultimately profited from it. Though Mortal Kombat was huge in the 90s, my favorite Mortal Kombat games have always been Deadly Alliance and Mortal Kombat Deception. I always enjoyed how different those games were from other fighters. It's a shame we'll probably never see that kind of fighter again, but it's still cool to see Mortal Kombat go back to its roots and create some more bloody memories. Now keep in mind, some of what I said was based off a personal experience. I would love to hear your personal experience and how Mortal Kombat drew you in. Thanks for listening to another episode. If you liked this episode, please hit the like, and if you want more episodes, click the subscribe button. If you like the music that was used in the video, you can listen to it without my voice by clicking the link in the description below. This is Game Analyzer, signing off.